benefit from his or her education. So the term that we're going to be returning to throughout this presentation is educationally necessary mental health services. For the first decade after the federal law created this entitlement, school districts provided those mental health services, either directly with their own staff, or sometimes they hired private staff or contracted with the counties. After about a decade of that, though, there was some concern and frustration about the quality of services that schools were providing, and the legislature started slowly shifting this responsibility over to counties. And today, counties are responsible for the more serious mental health problems associated with these children, not sort of short-term counseling, but any child that needs ongoing counseling in order to benefit from his or her education. Today, counties provide what we call AB 3632 services to about 20,000 pupils. Each one of these pupils is a special education student with a mental health services identified on his or her IEP. About half of these students are also enrolled in Medi-Cal. If you turn to the second page of the handout, you can see a series of years for this program. And 2007-8 is the last year for which we have full cost data. And that year shows $282 million. And you can see this program is funded from many different parts of the state's budget. The first three items go to counties directly. There's some federal special education funds, and that's redirected from schools and it goes to counties for the 3632 program. There's also a categorical under Department of Mental Health. There is some money under Department of Social Services. It's listed as foster care, but these are kids for whom the parental rights have not been relinquished, but these are children that need to be in some kind of residential setting. And so some of the cost of this program is budgeted under the Department of Social Services. To the extent that a county's costs are not covered by those first three items, the county files a mandate claim and gets reimbursed for its additional cost. And you can see that line item there, it's mandate reimbursements. Schools also get some funding to provide intervention programs and to coordinate with the counties associated with 3632, and you can see that that's the $31 million there. So overall, the cost of this program is about $282 million in 7-8. In 8-9, it appears that the mandate reimbursement amount has gone down, but that's just because all the bills haven't been submitted yet. Okay. If you turn to the next page, we have our assessment of the current model for the 3632 program. And from our standpoint, as we see this program, it's weak from a cost containment standpoint, an educational standpoint, and an accountability standpoint. From a cost containment standpoint, counties are reimbursed for whatever cost that they experience under this program. There is no fiscal pressure for them to contain the cost of this program, no direct fiscal incentives. It also, from an educational standpoint, it puts county clinicians in the position of authority over a program that is providing educationally necessary mental health services. And then lastly, in terms of accountability, while many counties are doing a very good job with this program, counties are reimbursed regardless of whether they're getting good mental health outcomes or educational outcomes. And we don't even have data as to the educational outcomes or the mental health outcomes of these 3632 services. If you turn to the next page, it's a summary of the administration's May revision proposal. The administration proposes to suspend the county mandates on schools. And what mandate suspension means is all the provisions regarding AB 3632, they're in the government code. They'll all stay right there in the government code exactly as they're written. But in the Budget Act, you'll have one line that says that identifies the mandate as being suspended. It turns off the county responsibility for providing these services for the course of one fiscal year. And during that time, because federal law provides an entitlement to these students, the obligation would revert back to schools. In terms of the fiscal effect of suspension, the Constitution specifies that in terms of non-education mandates, and this is considered a non-education mandate because it's a duty placed on the county, The Constitution specifies that the legislature has to fund all the recent bills for the mandate or suspend or repeal the mandate. Now, since the administration's proposing to suspend the mandate, the state would not be needing to pay the bills, at least in this next fiscal year. And the total bills that are sitting over in the state controller's office associated with this mandate are $133 million. That's all the recent bills associated with this mandate. Our office's assessment of the governor's proposal is that it'd be temporary, confusing, and disruptive. This responsibility for the mental health services for over 20,000 students would shift literally within days from counties to schools. There are some very significant transitional issues, and mandate suspension doesn't provide time to address those transitional issues. And lastly, eliminating the funding for the 3632 program would, in our mind, potentially violate the federal special education maintenance of effort requirement. If you turn to the next page, we outline the LAO alternative regarding the 3632 program. In our view, it makes sense to return this program to school responsibility, which I should point out is the way that this entitlement is handled in every other state in the United States that we're aware of. But we think that making this transition is going to take time. We noticed that in the 1980s, when this program was transitioned from schools to counties, the legislature provided about a 2-year phase-in period. And we're thinking that a phase-in that's literally within days is just too short. In light of the state's fiscal difficulties, we're thinking that we could transition this program across 1 year, and we're outlining a plan to do this. What we'd recommend is that the legislature enact trailer bill legislation this year that specifies that by July 1, 2011, the mandate on counties would end, and this responsibility would return to schools. We'd also suggest that you convene a working group, effective immediately, to start addressing the enormous transition issues and discussing matters, for example, the federal special education maintenance of effort, and also any necessary increase in school funding. We'd suggest that you set aside some funds because some school districts could be in the position of piloting this transition during the budget year and providing very helpful information to the working group about how to make the transition more effective for the rest of the districts. So we're recommending that you keep the mandate on counties alive for 1 more year. For most districts, then, the counties would continue to carry out the activities. We would have a task force working to iron out the transitional issues, and then by July 1, 2011, the responsibilities would be assigned to schools. If you look through on page 5 in terms of the financing, and you look to the far right, you can see the LAO fiscal approach. In terms of the federal special ed funding that is currently redirected to schools to counties, we would redirect less. We would say give the counties $49 million, and you can see an additional $20 million at the very bottom, federal special education to schools. We'd suggest that that $20 million be used for the schools that are willing to pilot this during the budget year to help pave the way for an effective transition. We also show under the LAO model the $133 million from mandate reimbursements. That's the minimum necessary to keep this mandate alive, to keep counties responsible for carrying out this program during the budget year. Under the mental health categorical in the Department of Social Services, we do not show funding. Certainly that is an option for the conference committee as to whether you wish to provide some funding in those items. We should point out that it is not constitutionally necessary. It is not the minimum necessary in order to keep this program alive for another year. Certainly not providing funding in this area, though, would put increased fiscal pressure on counties, and that's something that you should be aware of. If you turn to the final page.
Look at the mandate reimbursement eventually, though.
thank you. Rachel was just pointing out a very important point, that any additional costs that counties incur, they will file mandate claims, and the state, of course, would be obligated to pay those costs over time. In terms of the final page, the assessment of the LAO proposal, in terms of its strengths, it establishes a process and an orderly timeline for transition of these services. We create a better program model, one where schools make the decision as to what's educationally necessary, and schools provide or contract for the mental health services that their students need. The model encourages effective cost containment provisions of services by eliminating the automatic reimbursements of the program cost. You can see, though, at the bottom there where we identify the limitations. There would be some, if you provided only a minimum amount of funding constitutionally necessary, there'd be some near-term county fiscal pressure associated with this transition, and it also would be deferring some state cost associated with the program to future years. And with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Before we go into that discussion, Ms. Skinner wanted to make an introduction.
Thank you. I wanted to welcome 60 of my constituents who are here, students from Rosa Parks Elementary School in Berkeley, who are being incredibly patient and quiet, and it's fitting that you're here today because the Budget Conference Committee is discussing education. I imagine that the discussion we just had may have been very complex, but we are trying to, we are listening carefully and trying to protect the services that the state provides to our schools in every level, including mental health services, which is what we are discussing today. These young elementary students took Amtrak this morning to come to Sacramento to learn more about state government, and I think it's really good again that they're here and to remind us who we are, why we're doing the job we're doing, and why we're dealing with education right now is to protect and serve students like them. And thank you very much for coming today.
Ms. Ellers, you want to chime in, and then we'll let finance comment too.
I don't have too much to add at this point. I'm happy to answer any questions from an educational perspective.
Well, I think the biggest one is, when we did this, it was because many schools weren't able to actually provide the services. That's why it was done the first time, and I think part of the question, I don't know how we sense from the field the ability now to change that. I know when we had in 2004, 6, one of you will remember.
4 or 5. Mm-hmm.
We went through this. We did, at least temporarily in San Diego, go to an MOU situation, which actually didn't seem to be the worst of all possibilities, but I don't know that that would work statewide, and I mean, it goes to the transition issues that Marianne points out, but I'm still a little skeptical about whether school districts want to take it back on. We hate mandates after yesterday. So, getting rid of a mandate is a good thing, but the mandate on us remains, or the mandate on the schools remains from the federal government. And so how they meet it, it would still require county services. Now, maybe that contracting for county services is more efficient now than it was in 1983. But that's hard to sort through.
Yeah, we met with the statewide CELPA directors, all of the special ed groups from across the state, and they actually have a formal position, which I'm sure they can share with you, where they are willing to take it back. And I don't think they want to do it quite this quickly. I think they wanted a little bit of a longer transitional period.
It might be 2 years. Yeah.
But it is a federal requirement. It is supposed to be linked to students' educational outcomes. This is the only area of the special ed program and the special ed mandate that we have kind of separated and created a bubble around, where school districts are responsible for meeting the educational needs of all of their other children with all of the other disabilities. We entrust them, and the federal government
so they do interaction with the regional centers now, or with whoever else they have to?
If they don't have the expertise on site, they find someone who's got it because it's their federal requirement requirement to do so. So given the relationship between the counties and the districts, you can imagine that they will continue to have the same kinds of contracting and relationships that they have right now, or maybe they will hire staff to be on site at districts if they have a sufficient population. But the linkage, I think, in our mind will be much closer between the educational needs of the kids and getting whatever services that they have met. The federal law is a lot stronger now, is our understanding, than it was in the early 80s when a lot of these problems came. The IDEA, federal special education law, has been strengthened to protect the rights of children with disabilities. So certainly there will be transitional issues. Certainly there are going to be people who aren't happy with change. But I think we've been hearing that it's not working perfectly right now. And again, every other state that we know of in the country
is doing it with the SELPA or SELPA type.
Isn't farming it out, right?
Well, that's interesting.
Madam
All right. Hold on one second. I wanted to let finance, then I've got Mr. Bloomfield and Mr. Fuentes.
Gina Orpeza, Department of Finance. Our action to eliminate this mandate was simply driven by the inability to fully fund the mandate. And under that 1A, if we're not funding the mandate, it's suspended. And so the counties felt that if we were not going to fund it, they'd prefer to see the mandate suspended. We recognize the transition issues and all of that and are sympathetic, but we simply didn't have the money on the
the problem is you're sort of dumping it on the schools. So,
Well,
I mean, let me ask something that bases out of yesterday. What's the availability of some of these other federal or this SDA money or some of these other things to help schools meet this challenge?
I think they could use, it's just simply money that we provide for special education services. So clearly we could look at the overarching, what the special aid needs are and how much money we provide to schools from federal and state dollars and see where we can redirect or work with the SELPAs to ensure
because you're still going to
provide
have to spend the money. So the question is only, and I do think there is something to be said for cost containment when the county office of ed or the SELPA or whoever is contracting for the service with the county rather than having it be a mandate claim reimbursement. So, I mean, there's something to be said for possible cost containment there, but there is some caution here.
Right, and I think that's also one of the reasons that was one of the primary things we thought could be worked out over the course of this one-year transition is what is the true cost of the educationally necessary services that are being provided right now. How much more resources would schools need and how that would work.
All right, Mr. Blumenfield and Mr.
Okay, just
Fuentes.
first a comment, then a question. I mean, concern, of course, is that the schools are already busting at the seams with trying to deal with the costs of special education, and so putting an additional cost on them just seems very difficult, if unfair at best, but very difficult if not impossible. But the question I have, just in terms of understanding the issue a little bit more, is there or what is the difference between what's mandated by the federal government and what's mandated currently by the state? Are there particular activities that are different? Help me understand.
Madam Chair and members, Greg Jolivet with the Legislative Analyst Office. We've looked closely at the federal law and the state law, and our belief is that the state law builds on the federal law. It does not expand services beyond what's required in the federal law. The services that children receive in AB 3632 under current law pretty much mirror the services that kids in other states receive, even though they don't have their county mental health departments involved. So we don't really see any richer services under AB 3632 than would be provided under or required by schools under federal IDEA.
And is it just sort of broad across the way, or technically you're really saying it's the exact same?
Yeah, well, exact same thing. I mean, a lot of times the federal law is broad, and then states have to come in and sort of fill in the details, elaborate on what counseling means, for example, and that's what we do. What we have here in California, though, is an environment, because of the way that the program is structured, in which perhaps it's easier for counties and the mental health departments to include services that might not otherwise be included and are not necessarily required either by federal or state law. And that might be the case, for example, with a child who is eligible for 3632 services, but who also participates in the Medi-Cal program and therefore has a richer set of benefits for which the counties can be fully reimbursed.
But that is part of the question, is sort of the linkage the counties have to make with the mental health services to keep the Medi-Cal. Are there other federal matching funds related to this program? Just before Mr. Fuentes.
I think the Medi-Cal issue is a big one in terms of the transition, because our understanding is that counties can bill at a different rate than schools might be able to bill at, and so that would certainly be one of the transitional issues.
How many students would be eligible for Medi-Cal is a county responsibility to figure out, and then you want to make sure you're getting the full benefit of that and not having the school pay for the service when Medi-Cal federal funds could pay for half of it, or however that works. Mr. Fuentes, and then
just on the point that Mr. Blumenfield was making, I think it'd be helpful if the LAO could provide a chart or some sort of comparative document that demonstrates what it is that the federal requirements are and what the state requirements are on these mandates.
We can do that, no problem.
Okay, Mr. Leno, and then Ms. Skinner. You too.
On the same issue of the federal requirements relative to the state, are you saying that filling in the blanks of the broadly worded federal requirements cost us $133 million over about 5 years? I mean, what is that additional reimbursement for if we're getting money from the feds to comply with their mandate? We've got federal special education money that's not mandate related.
Are you asking why we're paying state money for a federal mandate? Is that the question?
Yeah.
It's because we as a state have chosen to pass along this responsibility to the counties and have created a state mandate. So if the state mandate were eliminated, it would revert to being just a federal mandate.
Very good.
Yeah, the feds still wouldn't be paying for it.
Well, the feds wouldn't give us any more special ed money than they're already giving us. They're already giving us a certain amount of special ed funding to meet all students with special needs.
But we're already spending all that money without paying for mental health services.
That's correct.
And
so
that's
the $69 million
is.
that's currently going to counties would come back to schools. So that's one piece that would come to schools.
Yeah, but they'd have to turn around and contract with schools to counties to provide the services. I mean,
but it goes back to my question then, what additionally are we doing that is beyond federally required? Because it amounts to some significant amounts of money, right?
The cost containment issue, probably.
I don't believe that the mandate reimbursement amount reflects services that are provided above and beyond what's required by federal law. It represents costs, certainly, that counties have related to these kids, but if the mandate had not been established, these costs would have been borne by the schools and paid for by that special education money that they get. And I don't know what the schools would do to the extent that it costs more than the feds give us, but that is the issue.
I think that's been the issue, and that's how we got into doing the mandate in the first place. But
the mental health component of special education funding is not separated out.
That's the
all right. So schools get an overall amount for special education services. The mental health component of it was shifted over to counties, along with some funding, as you can see from the mental health categorical and the Department of Social Services funding. However, any cost and above that amount is reimbursed as a mandate. So if you think of what the state is really spending for counties to provide the services, you take a look at the categorical amount, the Department of Social Services amount, and the mandated component, and that's all funding that the state provides counties to provide these mental health services.
The DSS amount, for instance, could that come back to the schools too, or is that just county money that?
Sure, that money is being used to house kids for residential care. Kids.
All right, so they could still use it for that.
Right.
And then one
Skinner,
last follow-up question. Did the LAO support the legislative response in 1984 of 3632 or has your mind changed since then? Or have you been? I'm just sort of curious what the history
I've been
was.
around for a long time, but 1984 was like the year before I came. So
We'll ask Ms. Cummins. Ms. Skinner? Dion, you were here. Where's Dion?
What? After I was appointed to Budget Conference Committee, I guess, I didn't have all the materials, but, people seem to get a lot of these things quick. I got a lot of calls from my area, and I thought, why on this one, more than relative to others? So I asked my staff to look back and get me some information and give me some history on this. And what I learned is that there was that AB 3632 was basically in response to a class action lawsuit. In 1983, Christopher T. Was the name of the lawsuit, and basically, as far as I can tell from the research that my office did, and also what I learned is that this reversing of the mandate has come up again and again and again, and yet it's been rejected legislatively again and again and again because we don't have the ability to undo the federal settlement that was part of that case. So I just find it a little bit curious that LAO didn't address that. And it seems like that we not only is it part of the settlement, but also there would be a significant loss of federal funds.
Anybody?
Yeah, we'll have to get back to you on that. That doesn't. I know there was quite a bit of litigation about services for mental health services for kids happening in the early '80s, and that's one of the reasons that the state decided to remove the responsibility from schools and give it to counties.
Well, look into that particular lawsuit. The judge was Hadley. It was Christopher T., class action suit, 1983.
Right, because as we said, all the other states that we know of entrust schools with this responsibility from the federal mandate. So.
we're familiar with the lawsuit and some of the criticisms that were raised associated at that time, but that the program design was a part of the settlement agreement, that I'm not familiar with, but we'll take a look at it and get
It may
back
have been
to you.
responsive to it, but not, yeah. Mr. Huff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. LAO, how much was AB 3632 projected to cost when it was enacted? Do we know that? Recognizing you weren't around at the time, somebody was, and they left records, I'm sure.
It was considered to have just de minimis cost for the increased cost for the counties. In fact, a couple years after, AB 3632 was in 1984, as part of the legislation, schools were supposed to do a survey of how much they were spending that was going to be shifted on over to counties. And I've forgotten the exact amount, but it was something in the range of about $2 to $3 million worth of program obligations. It was a relatively small amount.
And do you know how much we're reimbursed now by the feds?
We're not reimbursed specifically for the mental health component of special education. It is a component of the overall program.
And we haven't really mentioned this one-page addendum to our handout, which I think you all should have too, which just shows the funding history. If you don't, I think we've got additional copies over the past 10 years. And so you can really see that, to get to Senator Leno's point, the escalation of costs and one of our criticisms of the current model is there really isn't any cost containment incentive given the current mandate structure.
It just shows in 1998 the total program cost was in the range of about $40 million, rising upwards to about $300 million today.
And if I understand correctly, we're getting $1.26 billion from the feds in overall special ed, $3.26 from Prop 98 for $4.46 billion. Does that sound accurate? Jeannie is nodding her head yes. In a constrained budget time, I think the LAO's solution is a creative way to handle this. If I understood your testimony correctly, we're the only state handling it this way. And so it's not like it's unprecedented to take away the state mandate and go back to just a federal mandate. It appears that everything still happens. It's just, in response at a federal level rather than the state mandate, and it takes us off the hook there. So I know we still have some information to come back here, and I suspect you're holding this open, but I would be willing to support the LAO's compromise with the repeal.
I'm sorry. I mean, it's come around the block before, and I think maybe it is time to do this right, but there is some risk. I mean, I think this is scary, the data and the numbers of increase, and I don't know whether it's because we diagnose better. I mean, maybe if we didn't have mandate claims, we'd have a better shot of controlling the cost. The pressure, though, if the costs stay the same because the need of the services is what it is, because we've got more kids who have more issues, whatever it might be, the cost pressure would then be on the classroom and on the schools, who would then have issues providing basic, I mean, already special ed is cost pressure on basic K-12 revenue limits, and it's already taking big chunks because the federal funds for special ed do not meet the cost of special ed today in the schools. If they are required to pick up another 52 million, whatever that has been the mandate claims portion, out of the same budget they're getting today, there are going to be problems in other school programs. I mean, I just think that's where the pressure is, and that's why this, the work group idea. I mean, I'm pretty open to it too, but I think we need to be cautious and check in with some of the counties. I mean, I know some of the smaller counties do this fairly effectively. In my Imperial County, where you've got a small county and you've got a county mental health director who can have coffee every other day with the county superintendent, and a strong SELPA, you can make it work. In a larger county like Los Angeles or even in San Diego, San Diego is what caused the fight in 2004, and we did get out of it by dealing with the County Office of Ed kind of taking responsibility, but it's harder to do than it sounds like, and I think we ought to check in with some of the counties and see. It is about that relationship between the SELPA and the county mental health services, and if it's strong enough and it works and people are coordinated at the local level, it can happen. Ms. Conway had her hand up before. I'm sorry, let me just jump over.
I was just curious. I mean, I know what I think I know, which isn't maybe complete information, but all of these responsibilities that the county mental health department is performing, are they actually doing that? How much of that is subcontracted out? Because these can't be services that are solely provided by the county. So I'm just thinking, if it's going to be contracted to work out anyway, then you're making the county the middleman for an agreement that schools could do themselves.
Yeah, the county mental health services are provided directly and through subcontractors. The largest counties tend to provide the mental health services directly. The smaller counties tend to contract with providers for delivery of those services.
Madam Chair, just one.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me. One additional point to your point about the increased cost for schools. The state will ultimately have to provide additional state funding for schools in order to meet our federal special ed maintenance of effort requirement. So the amount we're spending on mental health to counties right now is included in our our overall special ed maintenance of effort. So ultimately, the state will have to increase our Prep 98 special ed budget to meet that federal requirement. It's done in arrears. How much we need to do it, there are lots of questions that I think we would need to work on over the course of the year. But ultimately, I think the feds would not allow us to shift all of these responsibilities and eliminate the funding without increasing funding for schools, ultimately.
All right, Mr. Blumenfield?
I was going to...
Sorry. Mr. Nielsen.
Well, it would appear that this growth is unsustainable, and you would indicate that it's caseload, but are there other aspects of this growth in the caseload? I mean, not caseload, but this tremendous growth. It's a singularly caseload that's brought us to this $291 million.
There are a couple things that have happened across this time. First off, during the early 2000s, the legislature, by two actions, expanded county eligibility for reimbursement. Counties used to have to pay a share of the cost of this program, and the legislature directed the controller and the Commission on State Mandates to modify this mandate's reimbursability so that counties would get the full amount and would not have to pay a share of cost. The other action was counties in the past, if they were using some of their realignment funds, it was questionable whether they would be reimbursed. And the legislature modified this program so that it was clear that even if a county used some of its realignment funds, it was eligible for reimbursement of those realignment funds as a state mandate. So the legislature modified this, and that was partly the reason why the significant increase in cost. So that's a component. The other component is there is not a tremendous incentive, except for the cash flow difficulties that counties experience, to contain the cost here. So if you have a difficult student or a situation that looks like it could need either a higher level of service or a lower level of service, and you're now experience fiscal pressure, you're not going to be ultimately the bearer of the cost of those services. It's easier for a county to opt to provide the higher level of services.
In terms of one element, are you referring as a cost driver as well the IEP, meaning the individual education assessment and what is required? Has that universe expanded to student by student in any way?
I don't think so.
Probably not. Okay.
I think it's been pretty consistent, roughly 10% of our population, and then within that, this is even a smaller amount of the students.
Well, I found some appeal to the LAO's alternative, but I would like to talk it through just a little bit further then. The repealing of the mandate, I get that, and the constitutional obligation, that gives some benefit. I am sensitive to the chair's choice of words, dumping on the schools, though. Now, the special ed funds, could those be sufficient to accommodate this? I think the chair used $54 million. That might be a kind of a tough hit in a year like this for schools. Is there any comfort you can have as to how they could sustain this impact in the short run?
Schools actually received a significant increase in ARA funds for special education. And in that provision, the federal government allowed schools to actually shift half of that money for other purposes if they could demonstrate they fully met their need. So from our perspective, if you're going to do something like this, this is the time to do it, because schools, in fact, did receive additional federal dollars. They are one time, but that may help through that transition period to actually require them to spend those dollars on special education, because many schools are not spending those dollars on special education, and they could spend them, and it's a significant amount of money that they have available to them for these services.
Ms. President, could you get us any kind of more of a little explanation of that? I mean, that might be some comfort to the committee to be assured that the districts aren't just going to get, quote, a dump. And then lastly, I guess there's some recent experience that some of these stakeholder task forces are of value. That's been one of the proposals here. Do you have a lot of confidence that the stakeholders could come together in work groups and come up with some substantive changes or recommendations that would help this program become a little bit more constrained? Is that? I mean, I don't like just to have a bunch of task force and everybody sits around and meets and they give a report and then that's the end of it. But good expectation to be substantive conclusions.
I think that's one of the reasons we would really strongly urge you to adopt trailer bill language, clarifying that this responsibility will shift July 1st, 2011. Okay. Not have it be, let's discuss about whether maybe it should or how it might. It will. And,
figure it out.
And there is an end line there, and we all need to work together to get
Well, and that federal money expires in September of 11?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's got 3 years.
Madam Chair, you may want to leave this open, but I'd ask if we could explore that, because I'm somewhat compelled by the LAO alternative, but I'm comforted by the possibility of this ARA funding being a kind of a bridge,
available.
if you will.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think if we're going to suspend, at least to know that they've got something to do it with, and or eliminate in the long run. But I mean, the question of whether that money was spent all last year. I mean, we need some sense of survey of districts because a lot of them may have already spent all that money. Granted, they have availability until September of 2011, but I don't know.
Not all the money was allocated yet. They did the first tranche, so we'll get you more information.
All right, well, that's helpful, and maybe we can look at it that way and give us all a chance to check in with some county offices and think about phasing in pilots. I mean, there could be, I think, the piloting option, because there are some counties that are more ready to do this than others, and maybe some ability to do that. And certainly taking one less thing to the Commission on State Mandates would probably make all of us happy after yesterday. All right. So with that said, let's get a little more information on that. I think there's a growing possible consensus here, and just leave that open for right now. All right, child care, I think, is where we are. Change of characters, except Ms. Taylor's. Page 26, members, on the agenda. The study on early data collection. This was a Senate proposal from the subcommittee. Leo, you want to explain all the little...
Our understanding of this proposal was it was taking a federal grant we actually haven't gotten yet. There's a $10.7 million child care early education federal grant that the state has put together an early learning advisory committee that's working on an application to submit. It's due August 1st. So certainly we think that there ought to be legislative input into that application and what the legislative's priorities are. Seems like a broader policy conversation than just one particular issue. We think that there actually is a legislative group trying to put together a hearing to provide some input, so we would probably recommend deferring to that and going with the Assembly on this item.
Finance?
Sarah Swan, Department of Finance. So just as the LEO has stated, this is really kind of within the jurisdiction of the Advisory Council. The application is due August 1st. And also, the grant can pay for one-time activities, which can also include piloting the quality rating system, which there's a Quality Improvement System Advisory Committee, which has recently been subsumed into the Advisory Council. They have yet to make those recommendations, which could include data collection. So we think that this augmentation is premature, just in light of the fact that the Advisory Council has just started meeting and considering possible activities that could be funded from the grant.
I think it was the subcommittee, at least, was trying to get the data in there, sort of like pre-spending the water bond. I mean, it's something we know we don't have yet, but if we were to get it, it seems like one of the first things you might want to do is know what you're doing, which is the point of the data collection.
And just one other thing to note, we also don't know how this data collection system would at all interface with or relate to the CalPADS system as well. That's not clear.
That's all right.
There's a pretty exhaustive discussion going on with stakeholders and this council about how to spend this federal grant and how to apply for it. It does seem that there's not quite enough from our perspective as your staff legislative input going on in that, and so we're working to try and make sure that there is an opportunity for the legislature to provide some input before the application is submitted. But again, it seems like a much broader policy discussion than just this one activity.
All right. Well, let's see how that develops, if it's still focusing, and we'll leave it open for right now and see what, we'll get back to the chair and see what she thinks. I mean, it is an important issue, and I just don't know how that process evolves and whether we get enough input before August. That I think is really part of the question. All right. Okay. Are we at options for generate? Okay. This is the only portion of the CalWORKS Cal Child Care budget that got left open. Was the Senate intentionally left open the possibility of looking for cost containment provisions within it after restoring child care. It was not intended to favor any one of the particular governor's proposals, but just to leave those pages open precisely for this discussion, and the LAO has now produced some possibilities that we could consider. I doubt that we're ready to close on any of them, but at least to try to get the options. At the point when we heard this in full committee, we wouldn't have had time until we came to conference, so it was to get the options before us. Ms. Ellis?
So that was our intention in putting this together, is giving you options. Certainly it seems premature until you put together your whole Proposition 98 package. This will just be a piece of that. But to the extent you are making reductions and you do think that you need to find savings in the child care arena, we put together a list of ways you might go about doing that. It's not meant to be cumulative. The range of state savings for each of these options that's identified is kind of a standalone, and if you were to do several of these, they would have interactive effects and the savings would be different. For example, if you raised family fees but then lowered the eligibility ceilings for who was eligible, then the higher paying families would no longer be eligible and you'd lose some of the revenue from raising fees. So they do have some interactive effects. Our overarching recommendation for all of this is really that you would take steps to try and minimize the impacts on families and minimize loss of child care slots. So that will guide some of our focus here. There certainly will be effects. There will be effects on providers and on families regardless of whatever reductions you make, but trying to prioritize services for families, and particularly the lowest income families, would be our guidance to you. So the first item here, changing reimbursement rates, lowering the amount that the state provides to providers, speaking from this 3-page handout. This was a proposal that the governor put forth in February. It received lots and lots of discussion in various subcommittees. It's certainly an approach you could take. It does not reduce child care slots, but providing less funding to providers would certainly change the market and could have various effects on providers, either needing to charge more to families or making less income and the effects that could have on them. So there's a variety of ways that you could do this. You could do it just for license-exempt child care providers or also licensed providers, and there's a number of different savings that could result from that. The second item on the list is changing income eligibility ceilings. This would be lowering the eligibility threshold. This is the one item on this list that would result directly in less child care slots and termination of services for families. So there's a range of savings. The governor also proposed this as part of the May revision. The savings would range depending on whether you did it to all child care programs. So the governor was proposing to exempt state preschool from this, so that would be an option too. Turning to page 2, you could do a number of things with parent fees. They're pretty low right now. Nobody pays a fee until they are earning 40% of the state median income, so you could lower that and say you have to pay a fee earlier. You could raise the fees. You could have families have to pay per kid. Right now they only pay per family, no matter how many kids they have, so they could pay per kid. You could have the fees higher depending on their family income. So there's a number of options. The range of savings we think is only up to $30 million. So this is kind of a smaller ticket item. The fourth item here has to do with the federal dollars we are required to spend on quality improvement activities. These are things like professional development. The state's currently spending more than the federal government requires us to spend, so we could reduce some of the spending on our quality activities. We also have an idea that you could spend some more of this money on licensing, which would result in non-98 state general fund savings. $4.3 million, not going to solve your budget problem, but at least it's something. And again, I think to us, clearly professional development and services for increasing the quality of our child care system are really important. But in the climate you're dealing with, the trade-offs you're dealing with, this seems a lower priority, especially given we would continue to be spending over $70 million on these types of activities already. That would be the federal minimum requirement.
The $70 million is the federal minimum for quality?
Roughly, yeah. And then turning to the third page here, these are actually new options that have not been discussed yet in any of the subcommittees in our quest to try and find additional options for you to consider that don't result in loss of child care slots. The first is alternative payment agencies. These are the agencies that kind of serve as the middleman between the state sending out child care dollars and the dollars that get sent to providers that serve families on a voucher basis. They are currently allowed to take 19% of the contract amount in administration and support. So one option you could have.
If I may on that point, that seems very high. Is there a reason for that? There may well be, but that seems very high.
Statute says that 15% is for administration and 4% is for supportive services, but the regulations and the contracts aren't really clearly defined about what those supportive services have to be. So a lot of these AP agencies may be doing wonderful things about meeting with the families and connecting them to other health services that are available in the area and taking them around and showing them different child care providers. There could be all kinds of these support services that are happening. We don't know. We don't actually, as a state, require in the contracts what they do. And again, we also have resource and referral networks that we fund to do these types of things. So in the context of whether you're eliminating child care slots or not, we think this is one area you could look at reducing the administration and support below the 19%.
Alternative payment plan folks are also usually the care and referral networks, though, and
they're getting a separate funding stream to be the resource and referral side of things. So we fund resource and referral at about $20 million. And then also, if they're also the AP, they're getting this 4% support services and the 15% admin. You're right. There are a lot of times the same agency, but we do have a different funding stream supporting the resource and referral.
All right. I got a note from one of them that tried to lay it out. I'll share it with you. I got a note from somebody that tried to lay out what they did with the combination, and it may be that extra 4%. I don't know if you go to 10% and get away with it. I don't know quite what the 4% gets used for.
It is undoubtedly there are many areas in the state where this funding is doing great things. It's just that it's not supporting direct child care slots. And if you are having to make
transportation services, or
if you're having to make reductions, the question is administration and support more important than child care slots? And these are the difficult decisions that you're having to weigh.
Question on that point. It's attractive always to sort of go, let's cut the administrative overhead. But my understanding is we, meaning whether it's a legislature or whoever, have put a lot of requirements on child care administration, which increases the cost of administration. So I personally would be loath to just go in the direction of cutting administration if we didn't have a recommendation as to what kind of superfluous perhaps, or maybe we wouldn't call it superfluous, but perhaps what requirements have we put on the administration that we now, given the financial situation, we might remove in order to bring down that administrative cost and thus justify a reduction. Because if we have the same mandates on them and cut administration, we could complicate then the actual delivery of child care services. So I would rather see what type of administrative requirements we might be able to eliminate or reduce, and thus then what corollary savings might that justify in terms of a reduction. The only other place that seemed to me possible, and I'd need to understand it better before I'd be willing to act on it, is on the quality improvement funds. Again, whether there might be some savings there to offset general funds.
I think that's the $4 million she talked about.
Right. There's $4.3 million that you could stop doing some of the current quality activities and spend more on licensing to offset general fund, and then an additional $6.2 million that were kind of over the federal requirement that you could just reduce.
But can we talk about the reserves one moment, and then
Sure.
Mr. Leno has some questions too.
So the last item here, the provider reserves, we started asking about this because of actions we've taken on the K-12 side and found that the direct contractors who have a direct contract with the Department of Ed to run child care centers have no cap on the amount of funding that they can put in their reserves. So they've earned it. They've served the kids, but they have extra money. They serve them in a more cost-efficient manner. Some of them have reserves up to 200%. 2 years of full contract funding sitting in their reserves. Many of them are over 50%, over 100%. So certainly they need some reserve, particularly for a late budget, because if they need to continue to serve kids and hire staff, they need to have some cushion. For the AP side of child care, we capped them at 3% reserve, so we thought that would be a reasonable cap or level to get through a budget for these
But these are
direct
private
centers.
providers. How do we require them to spend it?
These are not private providers. These are many of them are school districts.
Oh, I see.
Some of them are nonprofits. It's state money. They have to spend these reserve, and all of this money in the reserve has been generated from state dollars. It's not private pay. None of it is. So we can't require. They've earned the funding. We can't require them to spend it. Our recommendation would be the way to approach it is in letting the next contract for the next year, let it for a lesser amount and require them to spend these reserves before they can earn additional dollars. The only thing they can do with these reserves is child care stuff. They can't use it for the way a for-profit would be able to use profits. These aren't profits. These are reserves that are kept in a reserve that has to be used, reused. It's like our restricted balances in K-12. It has to be used for child care purposes. They just, for whatever reason, aren't.
No nonprofit donations that have gone into that. It's all
earned
state
money
sweep.
from the state providing a per pupil amount for serving a child care.
Can we get data on that?
I have a run of all of them. Sure, I'd be happy to
give us
share.
some of that, because it's interesting that they would have. Wish we had those kind of reserves. Okay. Finance, did you want to weigh in, and then Senator Leno?
Yes, thank you. So we continue to support our proposals to cap the reimbursement rate, which, as Ms. Ellers mentioned, also includes deeper reductions for license-accepted programs, which have a lower operating cost structure. And then we've also, in the May revision, have proposed to reduce the eligibility ceiling from 75% of the state median income to 60%. And we also have a targeted reduction to the Stage 3 program. That said, we are open to a different mix of structural reforms, which could also include increasing family fees. There was some discussion by the Senate committee recently to that effect. With respect to some of the options that the LAO has outlined, we would be open to a reduction in the administrative and supportive allowance. The committee will want to take into consideration, to the extent that you adopt other cost reductions, you may want to take less of a reduction in the administrative allowance. And then with respect to the contractor reserves, our concern there would just be that it's not really cost containment. That would result in one-time savings. So, on a one-time basis, if that money is used for slots, then we would actually have to backfill that in budget year +1.
Okay, Mr. Leno?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question was about the provider reserves. So the $100 million jumped out at me when we were getting briefed. Is this a proposal or suggestion that the LAO has made repeatedly over the years?
No, this is the first time. This is the first time we've asked for the data and the first time we've looked at it. So that $100 million, again, represents the amount above 3%. So that would be leaving everybody with their 3%.
And so they're not profits. It's all state-provided funds.
That's right.
And you say they're already required by law to spend it. for childcare, how large can these reserves get?
There's no
What triggers any investment in childcare if they just accumulate now to $100 million?
There's no cap right now for these Title V centers, these state direct contracts. Again, on the voucher side, they do have a 3% cap. These don't. So
3% cap is the same as 3% reserve? No.
These that we're talking about, the reserves, are the direct funded child care centers. We also have a voucher-based system. Right. Those programs cannot have a reserve larger than 3%. We require them to turn it around. On these centers, we don't have that requirement.
So regarding effect on families and providers, you say no effect on families would lessen providers' cash cushion, but the 3% reserve cushion has worked successfully for vouchers, so there's really no apparent risk here.
That's why we would suggest you start here.
It's a great idea. Thank you.
Maybe you need, they need to have at least 6 months. You're right about the budget delays and some of that stuff and cash deferrals, but certainly one would think somewhere between 3 and 10, maybe creating some flexibility would be rational, but we'll need to hear from some of them. Are these are school?
A lot of them are school districts, county offices of education. There are some nonprofits, City of Sacramento, some city governments. So
fascinating.
All right. Yes, finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one kind of overarching point that we want to stress is that California does have higher reimbursement rates and eligibility ceilings, as well as lower fees than other large states. So just something to
We also
keep in
have
mind.
higher cost of living than other large states, and we also have families, I don't know, living on because the folks that would have this reserve then are mostly stage 2, stage 3. They're not stage 1, right?
none of these are the CalWORK centers. These
They're
are all
not
state
CalWORKs. These are all state preschool.
and general child care. All that have a direct contract with the Department of Ed.
Basically stage 3.
No stage 3, no CalWORKs.
Oh, I see. Just
all general child care, non-CalWORKs general child care, and state preschool. They have
so
a direct contract.
And it's paid with Prop 98 dollars then?
That is correct. Yeah.
All right. Interesting. All right. I think there's probably more to digest here. Members, I also have a chart. I don't know, one of the things we might want to share with folks is the sort of rates. I mean, the problem with the fees has been, we've done a family fee. I think we have a 10% of family income cap or something for most.
And that's federal guidance, too.
And that's, so then again, we got federal money mixed in here at some levels.
That's right.
I don't know if they let us go much more than that, do they? Is there a federal...
Yeah, it is in guidance, the 10% income, or pardon me, 10% as a percentage of monthly income. Yeah, just guidance, not actual.
It's I see what you're saying. It's not
and currently in our family fee schedule, that's just the maximum is 10%. Most of the families fall below that and are paying a lesser percent of their income.
Right, and many states don't have that cap.
It's just federal guidance that it be 10%. It's not a requirement.
Yeah, well, and some of the fees are low, and you're right. Maybe it is per child, and I don't know. I have to think about that one. All right. Anybody else? Contribution to this conversation? If not, we will leave this open and move on to page 28. Now, this is, I think, members, this is a technical thing. I don't think the Assembly heard the May revised caseload update. This is, I believe, just technical caseload update. Does anybody have any issues with adoption of the Senate version? Senate version caseload update from the May revised that I think the Assembly just didn't hear. You question or an aye? Is that an aye or a question? Okay. All right. 4-0 on the Assembly side. 4-0 on the Senate side. We'll leave the roll open for returning members who have wandered off to other committees. Page 29.
This was a May revision proposal from the administration to put in language to collect overpayments that were made to child care agencies or benefiting child care families. Both houses rejected it, but the Senate, I think, asked us to continue looking into it. we are still looking into it. There are some technicalities here that are different from the welfare world, where if there's an overpayment made in the welfare world with TANF, then you can go out, find it, capture it. The agency that went out to investigate the fraud gets to keep a portion of it, so that's an incentive for them. With our child care federal block grant, we don't have those kinds of rules. If you identify an overpayment and it's past the first year that the funding has been allocated to the states, we have to send it back to the federal government. So we're still looking into this. We think there is room for some some language that would be a lot more limited in scope than what was proposed by the administration. We want to be sure we don't jeopardize our federal funds, and one of the things we're working on right now is we want to be sure we don't penalize the wrong entity if the family benefited from it, but it was the agency's fault that that things weren't reimbursed in the right way. We don't want the family to have to pay for it. So we're still working on it. I think if we do come up with some language for you to consider, it will be much more limited in scope than what was proposed by the administration.
Well, and I think the department needs to figure out a system for knowing when the testimony we heard in committee members, one of the reasons we sort of pushed it over was because there was this allegation, if you will, of so-called improper payments, which nobody knew whether it was overpayments or underpayments, or and seems like the department doesn't have a real good handle on how they're keeping track of these claims.
Right now,
and a lot of it is not the family's fault, and it wasn't fraud. And if it really is a fraudulent overpayment, somebody got paid for a child they didn't serve, then those get referred to the DA. There is a system for that. And the language the administration proposed, at least as we heard it, impacted those who were not those cases that were actually intentional, sort of deceptive overpayments, if you will. And so, finance?
Just to clarify, so our intent is that if a family did not benefit, did not commit nor benefit from the error, that they wouldn't actually have to pay. And so we're willing to work on clarifications to our language as necessary. Just in terms of what has been reported by the Department of Ed and by their alternative program monitoring unit, goes out and audits these voucher-based programs. The most recent report that we received, which is based on 07-08, reported a 52% error rate. And these can be in areas
But we just don't know whether that's the color of the pen or the grease that fell down the paper, or whether it's real stuff. That's the problem.
Actually, I mean, it really can be more extensive than that in the area of eligibility determination, determination of need, family fees, and provider payments. In fact, of the payments that were deemed to be in error, 37% were related to provider payments. That can be selection of the incorrect.
But how many of them were underpayments instead of overpayments? You don't even know. I mean, that's part of the problem. It's not on you, but I mean, the department doesn't have a system. They report it as an error, and it could be, we forgot to fill out one line on the form. It could be we paid them $10 less than we should have. It could be we paid them $10 more than we should have. It could be we accounted for 3 children when they only had 2. I mean, there's a range that was real unclear, and there doesn't seem to be a systematic way of knowing what that range is. I mean,
there's certainly a range of errors. I mean, in some cases they were selecting the incorrect reimbursement ceiling and being reimbursed too much for the age and setting of the child.
Right. The department's current process is they look at errors that were made when the paperwork was filled out, but they don't follow the money. So they say, okay, there was an error made here, and they stop there. They don't say, oh, it resulted in overpayment. Let's see how much was paid too much. Let's go find it, or was underpaid. They don't do that, and part of that is because they don't have any fiscal incentive to do so, because if they keep looking and they find it, they'll find that there was an overpayment of federal money, and we have to turn around and send a check. So I think they view this as a flaw in the federal child care block grant regulations, and according to the Department of Ed, this is nationwide criticism that they have put forth to the feds. That said, even when they're doing their paper reviews, they have acknowledged that there are some glaring instances, and they should have some jurisdiction to go after the money. So we'll work on some language and bring it forth. I just want to give the warning that it will be less expansive in scope.
Yeah, no, I mean, if it can get to it, if it can figure out how to get the department to actually distinguish between a paperwork error that, they record as an error, and then everybody thinks it means you paid somebody too much, when in truth it was they forgot to fill out one line of a form, and they should have just got them to call them up, fill it out, versus, we actually paid somebody more on a claim. I don't know how to separate their. I mean, that's the problem.
We're still looking into it. We'll get back to you.
Talk to the department. Finance?
Yeah, and just a couple additional comments. So in a survey that was done, the best practices survey the Department of Ed did that was required by statute a few years ago when we put the APME in place, the many local agencies actually expressed concerns, including Los Angeles Department of Social Services, expressed concerns that there was no deterrent value to identifying overpayments and fraud because there was no legal authority to collect those overpayments as well as to impose program consequences.
I mean, I understood they actually do refer the fraud cases to district attorneys or attorney generals or somebody, so what's the problem? There is a referral network, and it's called, the law. I mean, fraud is fraud, and the district attorney can prosecute it. All you got to do is tell them about it.
That's right.
Madam Chair, Lynn Podesta, I think the issue is there's nothing in statute that provides an obligation for anybody to look at overpayments or to collect them. And there's no consequence in statute for intentional intent to mislead. So that's what we're talking about. And I think that's what you were getting from the 2005 Best Practices Survey. People saying, hey, there's really no incentive to do anything because there's no statutory obligation or consequence. So, maybe in an egregious case where there's chain fraud where the DA is actually concerned enough to go in and find it, then maybe you get a consequence. But generally speaking, there is none.
Well, the consequence isn't to the family. Clearly, the problem is at the department level, and sort of penalizing the families for the department's incompetence doesn't seem to be a favored position.
Well, the department is notably friendly. They want to be friendly with everybody. They've stated that's their policy. You know that, and you've heard it as well. And so if you want more information on the overpayment, we could put budget bill language in to determine whether the overpayment is under or over. But I would attest that 37% of those payments are provider errors. The department would have heard about them if the providers were being underpaid. So,
well, but a provider error goes back to this problem of did they just not give me the information that I required for some reason, or did I actually pay somebody an appropriate amount of money? And
yes, and we'll never know from the report to the department.
And that's the problem. The way they report it now, we don't have any way of distinguishing. Ms. Skinner?
I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this because there's been no data that it seems like claims are being made, but there's yet been data to demonstrate it. And again, I had my staff look into this, and they looked at this has been a debate in at least the last two, if not more, budgets, and there was requests from two various entities to try to produce some substantiation around these overpayments, and it's never materialized. However, last year, there was trailer bill language or budget bill. I don't know if it's a trailer bill or if it's a budget bill. I guess it was just a budget bill that directed the CDE to develop a plan to deal with the overpayments. So given that we did that, seems to me we should allow them to, proceed with that process. The other, and the chair mentioned it, but I think the way the governor's proposal is structured, the families receiving the child care would have to pay for overpayments resulting from errors regardless of whether it was due to any responsibility of their own.
Well, that's why the LAO is talking about a different version.
No, right, and good, but that would be very unfair.
Yeah.
And I think just due to, that we don't want to, while we would definitely want to correct if there's no overpayments, we don't want it to be egregious or to affect parties that wouldn't be the ones responsible. And since this has been an issue before, I think that's why the budget bill last year asked CDE to develop a plan. So I'm not sure why we're rehashing it now.
Because we don't have a plan.
Good point. The report really provided no plan, and that's why we followed up.
Were they given a deadline? So I didn't reread the whole budget bill to see whether they asked for the plan. Did we ask for it?
You should read the report. It's available.
They produced a report in response to that requirement, but I think there's some concern that maybe it didn't have enough actionable items to be considered a plan. I think it's a semantics issue. They did produce a report in response to that requirement. So we'll keep looking at the issue, and we'll come back to you with some concrete recommendations.
Maybe we can get folks that make sure folks get the report. I mean, I think that's the problem. It reported there were there were improper payments in this massive lump of undistinguishable claims. And so, and frankly, when CDE sat here during committee process, they could not identify them or separate them, and it leads into this kind of confusion.
So I think at least I'm not expressing any opposition to trying to correct the overpayments. It's just that before we can devise the proper strategy to do so, we have to have the data on it. You can't fix the problem if you don't yet know either the source of the problem or the cause of the problem. I know that we already passed on the item previously, but I just wanted to make a comment that I want to make sure that in whatever we held open the last item, and I know it's partly because it's Prop 98 and we have to deal with all the Prop 98s at once, but I just want to make sure that in whatever adjustments we make, that we be very conscious of when you're only earning so much, you can't have your child care expenses beyond a certain level, or it no longer is affordable to go to work. I personally had the experience where for 3 months of when my daughter, prior to her going to grammar school, where the cost of child care versus my income could not justify anymore my having the child care. And so I had to stop working for 3 months, and as a single mother. And I was in a position at that moment to do so. We have many families who are not. And independent of whether, it's not good for our economy either, because the further joblessness is not a benefit to us right now, and it takes that much more money circulating out of the economy, which of course is only going to hurt our deficit. So I want to make sure that as we look at these things, we're not creating a situation where it becomes no longer worth it for the parent to work.
Yeah, or for the provider to provide the opportunity. That's the two balancing acts, as the LAO pointed out. Mr. Nielsen, did you want to say something earlier? I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Page 30. Again, I think the Senate heard the May revised caseload. I'm not sure the Assembly heard it. Is everybody still comfortable with whatever number we adopted? It's a caseload issue, migrant child care. LAO?
Right. This was actually some savings we identified. It wasn't part of the governor's proposal, but we view this as largely technical. There have been unspent funds in this program repeatedly just because participation is down for the population that meets the criteria for this program.
Finance,
we don't have any concerns with this adjustment.
The caseload adjustment. Does anybody have any issues? Or
just want to do it as a one-time.
Pardon?
We'd like the Senate with just as a one-time funding.
Yeah, I think it's only a one-time.
We recommend it as an ongoing adjustment because the participation has been declining. At least this amount of funds has gone unspent every year. So you could certainly do it one time, and we could revisit it next year. But we would anticipate it would be the same situation next year.
We can direct CD to look at it.
Okay, Finance?
The May revision actually already took that into account as a one-time adjustment, so that was part of the reappropriation. plan.
That was current year, though. I think they're talking about doing it on a one-time basis in the budget year.
This is the budget year.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're acknowledging, I see, we already had this caseload reduction in the current year. That was acknowledged in the May revise, but the LAO says it's probably not going to change in the budget year, so we could acknowledge the savings now. One-time basis.
And then we direct CDE to look at ways to be more effective. And
Well, I think it's just a caseload. It is, the kids are either there or they're not.
That's right. The families that are eligible for migrant child care, the definition of migrant for this program is that they have to be moving in order to
a smaller population
for work-related purposes, and families are now settling more this population, so they're not meeting the criteria. So it would really be a policy change, a statutory change to the program in order to actually spend the funds. So otherwise, given the current program, these funds will continue to go unspent every year. So you could certainly do it on a one-time basis in the budget year. It's just that we'll probably have the same conversation again next year. If you wanted to change the program, it would be a larger policy.
Yeah, I don't know about changing the program. The question of acknowledging the caseload reduction on a one-time basis versus thinking that caseload reduction is going to be there forever is fair. I mean, and reevaluating next year whether in the Budget Act, I mean, it'll come back, whether the demographics are changing. But I think it is the experience around the state that more and more people they may work at different places, but they're sort of more place-bound, at least for school purposes. I know in my district, they travel in the summer, but they're always there for school. And there's sort of this, I mean, it's still a migrating population, but the children are staying more and more in one place for a school year, even if they travel to the north for the summer, or those kinds of things are happening. So.
There's no harm in taking it as a one-time budget year action. We expect we'll have the same discussion next year.
Yeah, just to see what it is.
But that's fine.
All right.
let's move that.
All right. On a one-time basis, the Senate version with the LAO's caseload reduction. I'm sorry, Mr. Dutton.
I do have a little bit of concern about the dialogue I just now heard, because you have an opportunity. We do have a structural deficit. It's not like we're going to get out of this mess. And you just heard them tell you that the LAO's recommending just go ahead and make it on go. You can always come back, but if the assumption's going to be that these programs just never go away, I don't understand how you're ever going to make the reductions necessary to even make a dent in the deficit. This one here just seemed like it was such a no-brainer. I'm having trouble now again. So I just want to make that comment. I'm going to vote no on what you're talking about a one-time. I think it needs to be an ongoing. So.
I mean, the question I think the Assembly's raising is only, is it really a reduced caseload? I mean, it's a caseload question, and the money's there. It's federal money. It's migrant child care. It is what it is.
And our analysis is that
they think it will be, in which case you will save it on an ongoing basis, as long as we don't return to a more migrant farm economy, right?
Madam Chair, this is Prop 98 money.
Yeah, it's Prop
98. This is Prop 98.
Oh, it's Prop 98 money. It's not federal
and
child care.
There's lack of participation, and certainly
we should acknowledge
savings and move on.
Yeah, but you take the savings now, and should the participation for some reason increase in the future, which I tend to agree with the LAO, I think the trend is that the caseload will not increase, and therefore these funds will be ongoing savings the way Senator Dutton's suggesting, but I don't know that we can predict next year's caseload this year.
And the Department of Finance, whenever they put together the governor's budget, typically does it estimating caseload, so they'll probably look at the caseload numbers when they're putting their 11-12 budget together for this program, and so you can take this action for 10-11, and then they can look at caseload estimates when putting together their proposal for next year.
Senator Nielsen?
I would just argue along Senator Dutton, this would be a very minor change, and we could always revisit it the opposite. Next year, if it needs to be restored, it can be. I'll just vote in accord with Senator Dutton on it.
The only decisions you're making right now are about the 10-11 budget bill. So you can put in your amount for the 10-11 budget bill, and then next year when we're building the 11-12 budget bill, we can decide what the amount is that's appropriate. So you can just, if you took the Senate action, this would be what would be budgeted for this program for 10-11. And then as part of 11-12, we'll look at caseload and decide what needs to be budgeted for this program in 11-12.
Yeah,
I don't think
like
you
we do
even
that
need to
every year.
stipulate whether it's one time or ongoing at this point. All you need to do is put in an amount.
It is the budget year amount. I mean, all we're doing is putting in the budget year amount, members. We're not saying it can ever go down again or go up again, depending on what happens to the migrant farm workers. But it is a budget bill, which is genuinely a one-year document. So, yeah, it's just for the budget bill.
That's fine. So let's not specify, as we're saying. I mean, since there's obviously disagreement over how we characterize it, but I don't think there's a disagreement in terms of taking the savings for the budget year. So let's move on what we can agree on and move on to the next page.
All right. So is that are we now 5-0? All right. 5-0 on the Assembly side.
I mean,
1-2 on the Senate side. And we'll just leave it there until the other two get back and see what happens. All right. Page 31, after-school education. This was a Senate's effort, one more time with feeling, to acknowledge the LAO recommendation that's been made in the past and that has been voted on by the legislature in the past to put Proposition 49 back on the ballot for the voters to decide if it can and should be more flexible and like other categorical programs rather than having its own, mandated funding amount. Ms. Sellers, is that the short version?
You summed it up. Our recommendation has just been asking the voters to treat this consistent with all of the other categoricals and make the decision in the context of your larger state budget issues.
Finance.
And we're obviously opposed to eliminating the funding mechanism for the after-school program. I think it runs contrary to the will of the voters to provide a floor of funding for the program. It also helps to meet the needs,
funding mechanism.
To meet the needs of working parents. I mean, the funding mechanism was part of the initiative.
No, it wasn't. It basically did not provide funding. It said the general fund will fund this regardless of how much money the general fund has. 98 will fund this regardless of whether we can fund teachers or not. That's what the initiative said, only they didn't tell the voters that. I mean, that is what it did. It said it doesn't matter if you have teachers as long as you have after school.
It did specify a particular amount.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it said a dollar amount regardless of what that impact was to the general fund. It did not have a funding source. It said the general fund will pay, 98 will pay, regardless of whether we were in crisis or not in crisis, or regardless of whether somebody had different priorities on a given day.
Madam Chair?
Yeah. Mrs. Skinner?
Yes, and sadly, that's a reality of a lot of initiatives. Personally, I'd be in favor of initiative reform that required an initiative to have a source of revenue if it increased expenditures. But on this particular one, the after-school programs are very the result of Prop 49 is quite popular in my district. It's resulted in more than $40 million for school-based after-school programs in my East Bay area, and I visited a good deal of them, and they are well-run, and it's very, very productive program, and I'm not sure I don't know if we had a dollar amount of what cost savings we would get for repealing. I think we had a March 10, 2010 report by the group Fight Crime, which shows that nearly 2,000 schools in low-income California neighborhoods still don't have any after-school funding or after-school programs. So I'm not sure if I'd be moving in the direction to repeal this one right now, but I certainly would move in the direction of having a rule where initiatives had to have a source of revenue if they increase general fund expenditures.
Well, I mean, the point, Ms. Skinner, is only to put it before the voters if it can be more flexible. I don't think anybody quarrels with the program. Certainly, they've been very effective in my district as well. But the question, based on the flexibility discussions we had yesterday, is if we're trying to allow school districts to better manage and we're going to give more flexibility on all kinds of programs, why would we not include after-school programs in their ability to determine whether, in a given day, the after-school program has a higher priority than home-to-school transportation or English language learners during the day or class size reduction, for that matter. And I think it wouldn't be any actual savings, but it would create flexibility in the future for the legislature. It would not be, the proposal is not to repeal it, but to modify Prop 49 in such a way that it is treated like other school categorical programs.
Madam Chair,
so
there is a provision in the initiative that says if we are in a test 3 year under Proposition 98, then we are allowed to reduce the program. We haven't been in a test 3, but we think that
we
the
think
initiative
we are this year.
Is
Somebody
sufficient.
said that yesterday.
We say we're in a 1, they say they're in a 2. So
I thought yesterday we were in a 3.
That's up to 3. You're right.
I thought yesterday we were pushing for 3.
No. So that was an 8-9 where we were. But the initiative does have mechanisms that do allow us to adjust. So we don't think that we need to take it back to the voters.
But only in a test 3 year?
Correct. And we've had mostly test 3s and 2s over the history of Prop 98.
Madam Chair.
Tell me when the test 3s were. They were before this passed, though. We haven't had a test. I mean, we had the 2 years that we didn't have to pay this because it was just starting up.
Initially, we thought that 2008-9 was a test 3 year. So that would have been the last one that I'm aware of. But we've had many test 3 years in between.
But my understanding is we
never lowered
can't
the
just reduce it at whatever amount we want, right?
There's a
specific
provision
formula.
that allows
It's
us-
still pretty restrictive about the adjustments that you can make.
It still allows us to reduce proportionate to the reduction in test 3.
It's pretty technical.
Yeah, it's not very productive, and that even the one time it's come up since Prop 49 was passed, it would have allowed you to save like $50 million, and actually in that environment at that time, it was just such a sort of modest solution in your overall issue. Despite that, you're facing the situation you're in now, and again, part of the proposal is to eliminate all state funding for child care.
Right.
And this is actually embedded within the child care budget. So the question I think before you now is, given the $18 billion problem you have now, is this one of the options you want to consider?
And it would be for the future. It wouldn't affect this year's budget. I mean, nobody thinks that. Mr. Blumenfield?
I just sort of wanted to ask why proposing this, is this more important than, let's say, special education or K through 3 class size or economic impact aid, things that you've proposed to put into the categoricals? Why is this more important?
Because the voters approved.
We actually didn't propose to add any additional programs. I think the Senate recommended.
No, he's
that we add
asking
more
you
programs.
why you're protecting this after-school program when you refuse to protect anything else.
This was passed by the voters, which is different than the other programs that were created in statute or through a budget mechanism. So that's why we have set a higher priority for this or any other initiative that's passed.
Except for Prop 36, which was also passed by the voters, which you ignored. All right. Not you personally, you finance. Mr. Leno?
Thank you. Ms. Orbe, wasn't Prop 49 just classic autopilot spending?
There actually,
ballot budget?
there actually was a trigger mechanism that had the program only trigger under certain circumstances. But then once it triggered, then we were required to spend a flat amount of money each year.
Right, and even as LAO has just pointed out, there are some allowances if we're in test 3, but very limited. This is autopilot spending, and I think the elephant in the room is that this is a glaring example of a bit of inconsistency, dare I say hypocrisy, on the part of the governor, who campaigned against autopilot spending and then, of course, put this $500 million piece on the ballot, which everyone loved because it was after-school programs, and who doesn't love that? So this is an inconsistency, to be gracious, and I think we would be honest to finally deal with it and put this back on the ballot.
Anyway, all right. That said, do we have any the Senate, it was a unanimous vote of the committee to recommend putting this on the ballot, if I recall correctly. But
We just
if
figured
you're not there yet.
with the whole, it's not that we're not there, but the whole 98 discussion, since we're closing all those items, we should do it as a package. But
That's fair. All right.
Not a substantive difference.
Leave it open to the 98 discussion. I mean, it just is, I think everybody agrees with Ms. Skinner about the program. The only question is sort of our ability to have greater flexibility in these times. If you're saying cut all child care except after-school programs, it sort of points out the problem. Anyway, all right, let's go back for one moment while Mr. Leno and Mr. Lowenthal are here. Page 29, no, 20, 30, 28 was a 4-0 vote. I don't know who was missing. Somebody was missing. Blumenfield and Leno were missing. On the Senate version, page 28.
Aye.
Mr. Leno was an aye. It was 4-0. You just weren't here. Mr. Blumenfield's an aye. That's now 5-0. Page 30, Senator Leno, Senator Lowenthal.
Senate again?
Senate version.
Aye.
What is the vote on that?
That one is 5-0 in the Assembly, 1-2 on the Senate side. Mr. Dutton was concerned that it might not be ongoing the way we were doing it. Okay. 3-2 Senate. That's it. That was the only lacking votes. Okay, so that was now 3-2. Page 30 is open. Oops, we've moved to higher ed. LAO? I think I have to... Okay. right. Let's see if we can. Yeah, now we're just more than enough to get through this higher ed stuff. But okay, let's. Tentative members, we got chaotic up here because we're at a break point in the agenda because we're moving into higher ed. The question was kind of, do we start it? We will get stopped by committees. There are excessive demands going on for other committees to meet that involve several members of this committee. So I think it appears that the consensus is to come back tomorrow, finish higher education, and hopefully, Ms. O'Malley, where'd you go? Mr. Cohn, that we get to do our local fiscal relationship, local state fiscal relationship overview that we had hoped to do yesterday and that we'll get to maybe tomorrow. If we can get through this higher ed agenda and at least get that overview so we're thinking about these restructuring proposals that people are off working on, thinking about the relationship between those tomorrow, then it's an overview on the state-local fiscal relationship. That it wouldn't be a action on the items so much as an overview. After we finish higher ed, which would come first tomorrow. So we would do the higher ed agenda, and I think that tentatively looks like the most of us are available at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. So tentatively that will be the time for us to come back so that all of the committees, hopefully most of us don't have, I think there aren't as many committee conflicts tomorrow. So, and Thursday we will be free of committee conflicts because we'll just have floor sessions. We need to move the urgency bill that we acted on yesterday and a couple of other bills, I think, on the floor before we could come in. So probably Thursday, figure upon adjournment and throughout the day as we figure out how many more things to do. So, all right, with that, we will stand in recess today. We remain upon call should anything pop up. Clear the room for a reconciliation.